Thank you so much for coming to my presentation. So the title of my keystone is Disruptions in the Critical Consciousness Development of Urban Adolescents. I will explain the jargon, I promise. So, racial and economic inequality continue to be significant and widespread problems in the United States. And research has shown that a quality called critical consciousness leads to a number of positive outcomes for the youth that suffer the consequences of these inequalities. Critical consciousness, broadly speaking, refers to an individual's ability to analyze, navigate, and challenge oppression. And the positive outcomes of critical consciousness include better mental health, increased civic engagement, and greater academic success. So the development of critical consciousness involves about 4 key factors, the first of which is worldview and social analysis, which is essentially one's understanding of the causes and consequences of inequalities. The second factor is societal involvement, commitment, and behavior, which refers to one's dedication to and engagement in collective social action. The relationship between these 2 factors is bidirectional, so they each foster each other. That being said, societal involvement, commitment, and behavior is actually the optimal outcome of critical consciousness. So this relationship is further mediated by one's sense of agency for engaging in collective social action, so how confident they feel that their actions are actually going to create change, and their access to opportunities to engage in social action and analysis. So in light of the protective nature of critical consciousness for marginalized youth, a growing body of scholars have actually called on educators to foster this quality in marginalized students. So for my keystone, I studied the critical consciousness development of students attending schools that incorporate critical consciousness into their curriculum and practices in different ways. And because my participating schools primarily cater to low-income youth of color, they are focusing on fostering consciousness of racial and economic inequality. So my research involved analyzing 3 years of interviews with 8 to 12 students at each of my participating schools. And for this presentation, I'm going to discuss my findings from one of my schools, which I'm going to refer to as Community Academy. And just as a note, I'm using pseudonyms for the school itself and for all of my participants. So of the 8 Community Academy students interviewed, about 5 characterized their curriculum as focusing really heavily on analyzing oppressive social forces, so the worldview and social analysis component of that model. One student who described this was Stacy, and she said, I think it's really good because some schools, they don't learn this kind of history. Like we're taught like how Christopher Columbus, his people, they slaughtered the Native Americans like no other. And some people, they're really ignorant to like some of the stuff that we're actually learning right now. And I think that's really key because as I'm getting older, I'm starting to understand how the world works and I link it back to what we're learning now. So you can see here that her school's focus on racial and economic inequality has had such a profound impact on her that she's able to apply it outside of the classroom, and it helps her sort of understand, as she puts it, how the world works. So another student, Danielle, was one of the participants who described her school's focus on analysis and was one of 4 participants who showed growth in social analysis from 9th to 11th grade. So in the 9th grade, she says, if everyone works as hard as another person or however hard they work, then they can go and have the same opportunities. And in the 11th grade, she states, when you're Black, you're already like labeled as something, even if you're not. You're already labeled a certain way. And you have to kind of prove yourself, and I feel like we're not given the same chance. Like my friends that go to another school just go to college, and a lot of these kids just get kept back, or they don't have enough money, or like they need a lot of scholarships. So you can see her shifting from an individualistic perspective of society and success to a more systemic one that incorporates the idea that people from different backgrounds can actually have disparate access to opportunities. And this is actually the mindset that is necessary for strong social analysis. So returning back to the model of critical consciousness development, Community Academy helped foster students' growing worldview and social analysis of racial and economic inequality. And throughout the 3 years of interviews, half of participating Community Academy students indicated that while their school really focused on analyzing racial and economic inequality, it actually lacked emphasis on skills for navigating and responding to oppression. So for instance, Stacy stated, they don't actually give us advice about it. Like we learn about like different things and how things are unjust and things are unfair, but they don't really talk about what to do if you're faced with that kind of stuff. And an additional student, Andre, actually expressed his frustration with this gap in the curriculum and said, the messages that I'm getting through what we're talking about is, hey man, you're still slaves and you can't beat the system. Slavery and stuff, like, I get it. If you're gonna keep on teaching us this for the rest of our lives in school, then what's your message? What are you trying to remind us, that we're slaves or something? Because it's like, what's the point? We're probably gonna be learning about it again our senior year, I'm a junior, and we're still learning about slavery, and I'm just fed up with it now. So you can further see from this excerpt that discussing the problems of racial and economic inequality, but not on effective responses or solutions, has actually led Andre to believe that the outcomes of oppression are ultimately uncontrollable. And 2 additional students in my sample from Community Academy shared these sentiments. So the notion that outcomes are ultimately uncontrollable is referred to in research literature as learned helplessness, which actually disrupts the sense of agency component of the model of critical consciousness. Helplessness also diminishes a person's motivation to take action for a desired result, which is problematic through the lens of our conceptual framework, because that motivation is necessary to engage in collective social action or societal involvement, commitment, and behavior. So the question then becomes, what's useful about all of these findings? And what's useful is the understanding that critical consciousness development requires a delicate balance between all of the factors in this model, because the absence of one can lead to a disruption in one's overall growth, positive growth in critical consciousness. And because schools can act as opportunity structures in the lives of marginalized youth during developmentally critical periods, it's important and there's value in helping educators learn how to foster this quality more constructively and effectively. So thank you for listening to my presentation, and I think I have time for a few questions.
This is really interesting, and being the balance of that sense of agency too. Are there examples of schools that are doing that, I guess, correctly in a way that allows people to feel like they have a way to change that situation?
Yeah, that's actually really interesting that you bring that up. So I think there are a couple of ways that you can do that. Some of the other schools in my sample follow what's called a no excuses framework, and a lot of the motivation of those schools is to sort of help students actually personally succeed in the face of success, in the face of oppression. When schools sort of provide like skills for those students to navigate oppression in the college process, like helping them fill out FAFSAs or like helping them learn how to engage in environments where they might be the only Black student in the room, the only student of color in the room, that has been really helpful for fostering agency and kind of promoting their own agency even further into sociopolitical agency. And then in addition to that, I think it's really critical that schools provide opportunities for students to engage in collective social action and sort of see the fruits of their labor. So engaging in something like volunteering, something like any kind of civic engagement, and being able to see that there's a positive outcome of that can kind of help them see, okay, my actions actually do make a difference. So I think that those 2 components, the second one is, I think, scholars would say that maybe that's more important, but I would argue actually that I think both can have really protective aspects to them. JP?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
So I was wondering, obviously you presented a small snapshot of all of the interviews. So I was wondering to what extent your students, the interviews that you analyzed, if they were aware of opportunity structures that were available to them, because I think it's not enough to just have the opportunities available, but it's really important to know that they exist. And
right.
Was there any understanding of opportunities from the participants in your...
That is an interesting question. And I think in the interview protocol, so for our larger lab group, that's something that we kind of had to figure out is how much are we actually asking the students themselves, what they see in their curriculum and what opportunities they see. And I think it kind of depended on the students. And I think it also depended on how explicit the schools were themselves. So the no excuses schools, for instance, we talk about it in terms of race and class as subtext. So when it is subtext, I think it was harder for students to really be consciously aware of the opportunity structures that were presented to them. But for the schools that were maybe more progressive, that were really explicit about their messages, I think they were a little bit more aware of whether or not there was an absence of opportunity or whether there actually was some. So I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah. Did you have a question?
This is very, I would say, fabulous to what you just presented. So question and comment. Question is, who is in charge of the curriculum changes, or do you offer any, you mentioned the word solution. So in terms of solution, what is your role to suggest to the school? Anything you suggest? And I was thinking, you mentioned inequality inequality so many times.
Yeah.
I don't know if these authors are taught or you have any role to play. Like Amartya Sen, he talks about inequality a lot. And Paul Antonia Paya, about this notion of pluralistic identity, which I heard sort of as a subtext throughout your presentation.
So your question was like, what role is sort of like this research and fostering a solution? That is an excellent question. I ask myself that every day. Because it's so hard. You're learning these things and you're sitting here in this room and you're analyzing this data and you're like, I just want to. So I think, sorry, everyone in this room is very aware of my struggle with that. So I think part of what we, I think, try to do in terms of our study is sort of publish our articles in journals that are geared toward both practitioners and people who are sort of in the theoretical world. And I think sort of publications for practitioners can be very useful for them to actually implement the practices that we see in the curriculum sort of in their classrooms. And I think, the data that I looked at was strictly the interviews, but for the larger study that I actually drew this data from, we have like field notes, so we actually go to the classes themselves and like take notes on what they're actually doing in the classroom. There's also quantitative survey data. So there are a lot of ways that I think in that sense, the research is very applicable to the classroom. So I think that's like the main thing.
Two questions, they're kind of related. So you did these interviews longitudinally, so some of your subjects probably graduated, right?
No.
Or only you had ninth graders, so they
So
all
we've actually followed the class of 2017 throughout their 3 years. I started on the larger study in its second year. So each of the students were there, this is their senior year, so they're graduating when we're graduating. But in terms of students actually dropping out of the sample, so there is like 10 to 12 students who were originally interviewed at the beginning of their freshman year from each school, and there were a few students who ended up dropping out of the sample. I only looked at interviews with students who actually stayed for all 3 of those years, because I wanted to be able to like make it a little bit more generalizable.
I guess my question kind of different then. Did you do any interviews after, say, some of your students were accepted into college? And I was wondering how that might, like the college acceptance or lack of college acceptance if they applied, might have actually impacted, say, their sense of agency, and then through mediating factors, any of those other factors.
So I think that the interviews are still in the process of happening. Yeah, so they're still in the process of happening, and I'm going to be helping analyze them this summer, so stay tuned. We'll see. Erin?
Yeah, so I think that this is really awesome work, and I was wondering, does this project have kind of an interest in continuing on to see if there are positive outcomes for students that generally go through this type of curriculum? And then, is there any interest and hope for making policy changes to show, this sort of educational system creates positive outcomes for these groups of students, and as a result, in the public school system, this should be happening as well?
What was the first thing you said?
Are you continuing to add on to this research to see if students that are going through this type of curriculum have more positive outcomes than students who aren't? And is there a way to then try and create some sort of policy change to include this type of curriculum in the public school system?
So there is an initiative within our lab to actually follow some of these students after they graduate. So hopefully, I think that would be really awesome. And in terms of policy changes, I think it would be absolutely wonderful if this could be something that could be implemented in public schools. I mean, in general, the mainstream curriculum that we see comes from, all of our textbooks come from the same places and are sort of these like dominant narratives. And I think deconstructing those dominant narratives would actually be very useful. I mean, the Christopher Columbus example is a perfect one. I didn't learn that, he wasn't just this wonderful human being who came to the United States and had Thanksgiving and it was all great until I actually came to college. So I think that there definitely are implications for that, and I would hope that this kind of research can actually affect policy. Okay.